Thank you very much, Ben. And hello, thank you so much for being here. There might be a few people from the UK tuning in via the live stream, including, I believe, my grandparents, so I hope they've managed to make it work. Hello, Grandma and Granddad. And also perhaps a few people in France, so bienvenue. And welcome to all of you. So today I'm going to be talking about the research I'm conducting at the University of Leeds. But before I tell you a bit more about the details of this research, I want you to take a look at this quote from astrophysicist and successor to Carl Sagan as the presenter of the TV science show Cosmos, Neil deGrasse Tyson, who said recently in an interview, "My concern here is that the philosophers believe they are actually asking deep questions about nature. If you're distracted by your questions so that you can't move forward, you're not being a productive contributor to our understanding of the natural world." I don't think this would necessarily be an uncommon response to get from a scientist today if you ask them about their opinion about philosophy or the relationship between science and philosophy. Here's another famous science popularizer. He's an evolutionary biologist. He has published, he's also a science popularizer. He's published several pop science books such as The Selfish Gene, The God Delusion. Of course, I'm talking about Richard Dawkins. And he likes to express himself via tweets. So here's what he has to say about philosophy. "At its best, philosophy can aid understanding. At its worst, its jargon supplies a handy toolkit for charlatans to bamboozle the innocent." Here's another one. "Am I alone in finding the very idea of continental philosophy ridiculous? What would we think of a university that appointed someone to teach continental chemistry? Continental algebra? Does it tell us something about philosophy as an academic discipline?" And I couldn't resist adding this one. This one's my favorite. "Philosophers' historic failure to anticipate Darwin is a severe indictment of philosophy. Happy Darwin Day." So with these science popularizers, there's this idea that philosophy can be an obstacle to proper knowledge. And by proper knowledge, they no doubt mean hard, serious scientific fact. There's also the idea that philosophical knowledge is not to be taken seriously compared to science. And I think there are several problems with these statements, not least of all the fact that this strict separation between scientific knowledge and philosophy that these two science popularizers take for granted has not always been taken for granted. The idea that science and philosophy should be held separate has not always been advocated by scientists. And so this is what I want to talk about today. So here are two other science popularizers, but this time from over 100 years ago. First, we have Scottish zoologist and science popularizer John Arthur Thompson, who in 1911 wrote, "The time is ripening for a closer cooperation of philosophy and science, and the man of the time is Henri Bergson." And here we have another zoologist and science popularizer, Julian Huxley, writing in 1912, "Bergsonian philosophical biology may help to decrease still further the gap today happily lessening between science, philosophy, and the ideas and interests of everyday life." So what I find very interesting is that contrary to deGrasse Tyson and Dawkins, these scientists believe that science could benefit from being a bit more philosophical, and likewise that philosophy could perhaps benefit from being a bit more scientific. And you may have noticed the name of a French philosopher appearing in both these quotes. Henri Bergson was helping them achieve just this. So my research looks at the reception of this French philosopher, Henri Bergson, among the biologists of his day. My project essentially looks at how some 20th century scientists integrated philosophical ideas into their scientific research. More generally, I'm interested in the relationship between science and philosophy, or between science and different forms of knowledge. So I want to try and develop some of these themes today. In the first half of the talk, I'll concentrate on Bergson himself. He had a very interesting life. And I'll also give you a few key points, a sort of introduction to his philosophy, and I'll try and help you understand why he appealed to so many biologists. And in the second half of the talk, I'll discuss the cases of three Bergsonian biologists. So one I've already mentioned, Julian Huxley, And there are two others, Edward Stuart Russell and Arthur Derbyshire. And I want to look at three different ideas that Bergson develops in a book he wrote on evolution, and how these three biologists integrated these ideas, each of these ideas, into their biology. So I'll start with Bergson. So you may or may not have heard of this guy, but if this lecture were taking place 100 years ago, chances are you would have heard of him. He was internationally famous. But before I get to that, I'll back up a little bit. So he was born in 1859 in Paris, which is not a bad year to be born if you're going to go on to write about evolution, because as some of you might know, that's the year that Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species, and we actually have a first edition here at the library that's going to be on display after the lecture. And Bergson was a gifted student. In 1877, when he was 18, he won the Concours Général in mathematics, which is still to this day, it's a competition that's organized on a national scale to reward students, the best students in each discipline. And the following year, his mathematics teacher published solutions to mathematical problems that a 17th-century French philosopher and mathematician Pascal had left without solution. And among the solutions that Bergson's teacher published, he attributed one to his young student, Bergson. So his teacher had high hopes for him, but he was very upset when he found out that Bergson was going to study philosophy after secondary school and not pursue his mathematical research. He allegedly told the teenage Bergson, "You could have been a mathematician, you will be a mere philosopher." So the reason Bergson chose philosophy is because to him it was a way of encompassing as many areas of knowledge as possible. He saw it as a way of avoiding specialization. In 1889 and 1896, he published his first two books, Time and Free Will and Matter and Memory. In 1900, he was elected professor at the Collège de France, and he also published a book called Le Rire, which was a quite popular book of his on laughter, which is guaranteed not to make you laugh. I can promise you that. At this point, he was starting to become very famous among philosophical circles, and a lot of the fashionable people of Paris started attending his lectures. But it wasn't until he published L'évolution créatrice, Creative Evolution, in 1907 that he truly became an international celebrity. So this book was almost instantly a bestseller, and then it was translated into several languages very quickly. The English translation came out in 1911. And so before Beatlemania, there was Bergson mania. So it said a lecture he gave in New York in 1913 caused the first ever traffic jam on Broadway, 1913. And these photos were published in a 1914 article that was about the almost weekly riots that were occurring because of Bergson's lectures. So as you can see, people were climbing up the side of the building to try and listen in. I think Bergson himself even had to report some scenes of violence that he'd witnessed and ask for additional security measures. So his lecture theatre could hold about 375, but every week at least 700 would show up, hoping to get in. So it was suggested at one point that his lectures be moved to the Grand Amphitheatre of the Sorbonne, which was bigger, or even the Palais Garnier, which is the big old opera house in Paris. And so because these were public lectures, they were a lot easier for women to attend than if they had been at the Sorbonne, for example. So if I zoom in here, you can see quite a few women trying to get in. And so you would get rich Parisian women who apparently would send their servants ahead of them to reserve a seat. So that would mean that the guy lecturing before would end up with a room full of servants at his lecture on whatever it was, I don't know. And most of Bergson's female students were legitimately interested in his philosophy, but the idea that Bergson was a philosopher for women began to be used to attack him, to say that he couldn't be a good philosopher if the least rational beings of all, women, were interested in his philosophy, enjoyed listening to him. And the women themselves were attacked. It was said that they were there only because they saw it as a fashionable event, not because they were interested in the philosophy. And although Bergson didn't really enjoy being called a philosopher for women, he nevertheless defended his female students, saying he saw no difference in intellectual ability between male and female students. So I've included some of my favorite illustrations from newspapers of the time. The one on the right is a cartoon that supposedly depicts a day in the life of Henri Bergson. You can see the crowds fighting to get in. You can see him, for some reason they've depicted him as pulling pranks. I think it's because he's the one who wrote the book on laughter. But apparently in everyday life he was not so much a funny guy. He was quite reserved. Contrary to what this cartoon depicts. I've also included my two favorite headlines from the time. So the one on the left I like because I can use it as an excuse. When my supervisor doesn't get something I've written, I can say, oh, but you see, it's necessary for one to become a Bergsonian before one can thoroughly understand Bergson. It's not because my writing is terrible that you can't understand. And the second one is referring to the fact that Bergson presided the Psychical Society for in London in 1913, but the answer to the question might disappoint you. He was actually quite skeptical about ghosts. So I'll leave it there. I'll leave that there. I'll let you think about that. Back to the timeline. So Bergson had a political career, a sort of secret political career. During World War I, he was sent to the United States on secret diplomatic missions on behalf of the French government. So the French government knew that President Wilson was reluctant to enter World War I. And because of this, they knew he would not accept to receive a French diplomat. So they sent a philosopher instead. And they did meet in 1917. We don't really know what was said. We don't know how much of an impact Bergson had in actually convincing Wilson, but we know that it happened. He also contributed to the formation of the League of Nations. He was on the International Committee on Intellectual Cooperation. In 1922, he met Albert Einstein. So that year, Einstein delivered a talk in Paris before an audience of philosophers. And during the questions that followed the talk, Bergson was sort of drawn in against his will, and they sort of debated a little bit. And Einstein is retrospectively seen as having won the debate, although, as Jimena Canales has shown in this book, I highly recommend if you're interested in these things, things are more complicated than that. But I'll say a bit more about this in a minute. But interestingly, at the time, Bergson's arguments against Einstein were taken very seriously, to the point that they were cited by the president of the Nobel Committee as reason enough to not award the Nobel Prize to Einstein for his work on relativity. He got the Nobel Prize for his work on the law of photoelectric effect instead. So it's interesting to see that Bergson could have played some part in that. In 1927, Bergson got his own Nobel Prize for literature. There's no Nobel Prize for philosophy. And by this time, he'd sort of removed himself from public life. He had quite debilitating arthritis. He'd never enjoyed being famous. He talks about it a lot in his correspondence. He did not enjoy the attention. And in 1932, he published his last book, The Two Sources of Morality and Religion. And he died in Paris in 1941. In the last decades of his life, he'd been working on a last project, but we don't really know what that was, because in his will, he explicitly said that he wanted his wife to burn all of his papers. So his correspondence, all of these notes, so as far as we know, she did, unless she hid them somewhere. I'd like to think there's some sort of Bergson treasure hunt to be had, but I think sadly, it's all been destroyed. So that's all I'll say about his life. There'd be more to say. He had a very interesting life, and he was very famous during his day. So a lot of people, I'm concentrating on his reception within science, but there would be many more things to be said from other areas. But I still haven't told you anything about his philosophy. So I'm afraid that during the next 5 minutes or so, I'm going to get quite philosophical. So Bergson was mainly known for his philosophy of time, or as he called it, duration. So I've chosen this painting by Salvador Dali because it's called The Persistence of Memory. And this idea of the persistence of the past is, as you're going to see, quite relevant regarding Bergson's way of thinking about time. So Bergson said that the way science talked about time did not tell the whole story about time. And this actually came up when he was debating Einstein. So Bergson had insisted that there was room beyond the theory of relativity, there was room for a philosophical discourse. Science provided a convenient symbolism for representing time, but never revealed its true nature. And Einstein's response at the time in 1922 had been short and scathing. He'd said, "The time of philosophers does not exist." According to Einstein, his theory was an objective account of time, and there was no room for Bergson's metaphysical theory of time. And it's important to note that Bergson was not, in principle, disagreeing with Einstein's theory of relativity. He was saying, this does not tell the whole story, there's more. And so Bergson said that the way we normally measure time or movement or change was by decomposing time into identical units. So for instance, seconds or minutes, that were then juxtaposed. And these units would be interchangeable because they're all identical. So time was represented as a sequence of identical units. And this is not how time is experienced, said Bergson. So here's a quote that I hope will be helpful, that's from a 1903 article he wrote called Introduction to Metaphysics. So he says, "Now, there are no two identical moments in the life of the same conscious being. Take the simplest sensation." So for instance, you can imagine the feeling of boredom, perhaps while listening to a philosophy lecture, I don't know. So he continued, the consciousness which will accompany this sensation cannot remain identical with itself for two consecutive moments, because the second moment always contains, over and above the first, the memory that the first has bequeathed to it. So in other words, Bergson was saying that two moments in lived experience can never be identical because however similar they are, the more recent experience is informed or modified by the moment that came before. And so he continues, a consciousness which could experience two identical moments would be a consciousness without memory. It would die and be born again continually. So real time or duration, according to Bergson, is not the succession of identical units, which would amount to an ever-renewed present, but it's the accumulation of past experiences which pushes forward as it grows. In his fourth book, Creative Evolution, published in 1907, Bergson applied these ideas about time to organisms and life. So he argued, among other things, that organisms are living things, life, by nature, are inherently temporal. He wrote, so this is a famous quote, but to exist is to change is to mature is to go on creating oneself endlessly. Once again, while he didn't disagree with the findings of biological science, he argued that biological science did not tell the whole story about life and about organisms. Science was good at putting things into well-defined categories, and as products of an evolutionary history and as things that are constantly evolving, organisms do not necessarily fit well into well-defined categories. So they had dynamic properties that these concepts sometimes failed to grasp. So, for instance, it would be impossible, if you really think about it, it would be impossible to pinpoint the exact moment when an organism goes from its infancy to its adulthood, because these are processes, and they're intertwined. And this sends us back to Bergson's definition of real time. Duration is the accumulation of the past that pushes forwards as it grows. So the past experiences are not easily distinguished from one another. It's almost like a snowball effect, if that makes sense. And so we use convenient symbols and concepts to make sense of the overwhelming diversity of life, and biologists have to use these categories, they have no choice, but this does not tell us the whole story about what life is, and that's okay. The scientists have very practical goals and they need to use these concepts, and that's fine, but the philosopher perhaps doesn't share these goals and can maybe spend more time actually thinking about these things, like duration. So in the time I have left, I would like to take 3 of the ideas that Bergson expressed in his book on evolution and look at how 3 different biologists integrated these ideas into their scientific thinking. So the first person I want to look at is Arthur Derbyshire, and I'll let you admire this fabulous photo while I have a bit of water. So the idea I want to look at in relation to Derbyshire is Bergson's idea that the human intellect is inherently limited. And it's not only limited, but there's an evolutionary explanation for why it's limited. So first I'll tell you a bit more about Derbyshire, though. He was born in 1879 in London. He started out as a very promising geneticist. He was conducting experiments on mice. He was well known among the geneticists of his time, and he had jobs in Manchester and Edinburgh. But unfortunately, his career was brief. When World War I broke out, his career was really picking up. He was getting job offers from the University of Columbia and Vancouver. But as his sister Helen Derbyshire wrote, he could not reconcile himself to leave England after the outbreak of the war. So he refused these positions. He very much wanted to fight for his country, and he was actually refused. He was deemed unfit for the army, so he tried enrolling again and again, and it kept being refused. He had suffered from a heart condition for his whole life. But in July 1915, he finally managed to enroll, and he died on Christmas Day of that same year from cerebral meningitis. So sadly, he never finished the book that he was working on at the time, which he saw as an attempt to give new foundations to biology. And he was actually in contact with Bergson at the time. Bergson had come to give lectures all over Britain, but he'd been to Edinburgh as well in 1913, 1914. And so they'd stayed in touch. And in May 1915, Derbyshire wrote to him and said, "I'm hard at work on my book about evolution. I think I'm going to call it An Introduction to a Biology. Biology as I think it ought to be, not biology as it is." And so, inspired by Bergson, Derbyshire believed that biology ought to be founded on understanding the limitations of the human intellect. So I've mentioned several times now that according to Bergson, science was limited in what it was able to say about certain aspects of reality, in particular the temporal or the ever-changing aspects. It wasn't always able to tell the whole story about these aspects of reality. So one of Bergson's ideas in creative evolution was that there was an evolutionary explanation for the limitations of the human intelligence. He said that our intelligence had evolved through contact with inert matter. We had started out as having to overcome very difficult obstacles from the environment, and so as our intelligence was evolving, it was confronted with these very material problems, which we tried to solve by building tools. So human intelligence, and by extension our language and our concepts, had evolved through these attempts to understand the external non-living world, to master matter. And so Our intelligence is very good at understanding static things, and it's very good at coming up with categories to sort of put all the different aspects of reality into neat little categories. But it wasn't so good, it's not so good at understanding the mobile and versatile aspects of reality, like time and life. The concepts often reveal themselves to be inadequate to talk about these realities. So, in other words, according to Bergson, somewhat paradoxically, our intelligence had evolved in such a way that it was bad at understanding evolution. And Derbyshire really liked this idea. Following Bergson, he said that scientists seemed to be naturally drawn to theories that followed this sort of natural materialistic inclination of the mind, of the intelligence. But Derbyshire went one step further than Bergson. He said, "We have therefore an argument for the view that the acceptability of a theory is evidence not of the accuracy with which that theory fits the phenomenon, but of its remoteness from it." So in other words, for Derbyshire, if a theory seemed to fit too well within our concepts, within our pre-established categories, that could be a reason to be suspicious of this theory. Perhaps the reason it appeals so much to our intelligence is because it fits with these categories that were created by our intelligence. So for Derbyshire, Bergson's evolutionary explanation of the origins of the human intelligence was a way to decide between good and bad theories. Science itself, said Derbyshire, the process of investigation should be studied scientifically as a manifestation of life. And this was reminiscent of something that Bergson argued in the introduction of his book. Bergson called for a greater collaboration between theory of life and theory of knowledge. So Derbyshire thought that being more philosophical could help produce better science. The second idea I'd like to discuss is this idea that I've already mentioned, that organisms and life are inherently temporal. And the biologist associated with this idea is Edward Stuart Russell. And, so he was born in 1887 near Glasgow. He attended the University of Glasgow, and his main career was in fisheries science. So he was appointed to the Board of Agriculture and Fisheries as inspector for international investigations. And by the age of 34, he was the director of fisheries for the Ministry of Agriculture. So he was doing very pragmatic things like reflecting on the consequences of overfishing and attempting to formulate the factors that affected fish abundance, that sort of thing. But in addition to all of this work, he was being very philosophical about biology. He developed very early in his career and all throughout his career reflections about the methodology and the theoretical framework of science, of biology. And Bergson helped him, played a big part in this. So Russell was quite active in a debate that was happening in the early 20th century. A lot of biologists were debating the status of biology. So one extreme would be, for instance, German physiologist Jacques Loeb, who thought that all biological phenomena could be reduced to physical and chemical explanations. And this way of seeing biology was labeled mechanism. The other extreme position was defended by another German physiologist called Hans Driesch, who thought that certain phenomena, such as the development of the embryo, could not be explained other than by invoking some sort of immaterial principle, a vital principle that couldn't be explained by the laws of physics. And so Russell, on the other hand, argued that a third route was possible. He believed that organisms did obey the laws of physics. There's no need for a supernatural vital force. But at the same time, this didn't mean that biological phenomena could be entirely explained by the laws of physics or by the methods of physics or the modes of explanation of physics. Some explanations were specific to biology. So he took the example of European eel migration. So here's a European eel. And during spawning season, these eels travel hundreds of miles to places where the salt levels and the temperature and the depth of the water suit their reproductive needs. But how should biologists think about this phenomenon? One way of doing it would be to sort of decompose all the movements of the eel, and then decompose each of these movements into the chemical reactions that made them possible. But would that truly be an explanation of the migration? Russell said, "A biological fact is more than an arbitrary assemblage of physical components." In other words, the whole could not be recomposed through, it could not be explained through the recomposition of the parts. And so Russell was here inspired by Bergson, who, again, in this article that I mentioned before, Introduction to Metaphysics, had said something along the lines of, so if we tried to understand this phenomenon of eel migration by decomposing it into its chemical components or chemical processes, we would be in the same position as someone trying to recompose a poem that exists but that we've never heard and never read, using nothing but the letters that compose the poem in the wrong order. So in other words, that would be very difficult, if not impossible. Russell argued that the biologist should be interested in the act of migration as something whole, and the chemical reactions involved should be seen as secondary. The migration of the eels constituted a fact of a higher order. Chemistry might be able to explain how the eels migrated, but not why. A true biological explanation, he said, would need to take into account the eel's inherited tendency or instinct to do so, and this would involve the history of the individual and the species. And so he saw, influenced by Bergson, he saw temporality and historicity as essential features of living organisms. He said, "An organism is above all a historical being. This fundamental fact alone is enough to absolutely distinguish between the biological and the physical sciences. In organisms, the past is always interwoven to a certain extent with the present. We could say, borrowing Bergson's expression, the past is extended into the present. Therefore, living beings must be explained by their history." So Russell used Bergson's philosophical reflections to weigh in on one of the big debates of the day. So the third and final idea I'd like to consider is the idea of a progressive creative evolution. After all, that's the title of the book. And the final biologist I'll focus on is Julian Huxley. So Huxley was also born in 1887 into a family that was already famous. You may have heard of Thomas Henry Huxley. He was his grandfather and was one of Darwin's good friends. He was nicknamed Darwin's bulldog because he often defended evolutionism against creationists in highly publicized debates. Another famous Huxley is Julian's brother Aldous, who wrote Brave New World, which you may have heard of as well. And Julian Huxley was well known during his life. He very much saw himself as a Darwinian biologist. He wanted to be like his grandfather, I suppose. But he did many things over a career that spanned almost 6 decades. He was interested in experimental and field zoology, a lot of eugenics, politics, as well as a career as a science popularizer. He was very active with the BBC. He did a lot of radio broadcasts. And in 1912, when it was his first book, he was very young. He published The Individual in the Animal Kingdom, and he was directly inspired by some of Bergson's ideas. And he was explicit about this Bergsonian heritage. He wrote in the introduction, "It will easily be seen how much I owe to Mr. Bergson, who, whether one agrees or not with his views, has given a stimulus, most valuable gift of all, to biology and philosophy alike." In this book, Huxley argued that evolution was progressive, and by this he meant that the general trend of evolution had been to produce more and more complex organisms. So it's important to note here that Huxley was not saying that evolution was following some sort of predetermined goal. he wasn't saying that evolution was directed towards the advent of the human brain, for instance. But like Bergson, Huxley was saying that evolution was creative. This meant that it was completely unpredictable. So by definition, it could not have a predetermined goal. And he was relying on Bergson's notion of creative evolution a lot. And what Bergson meant by this was that the evolution of animal life was the history of organisms becoming more and more independent from their environment. And this was often achieved through more and more complex nervous systems. So speaking very metaphorically, Bergson said that evolution was not overall, but in general, a grand movement of liberation of life over matter. And Huxley went one step further than Bergson. He believed that humans were the organisms that had become the most liberated from their environment over the course of billions of years of evolution. And this was true to such an extent for Huxley that humans were now able to take their own evolution into their own hands. So as I mentioned very briefly earlier, Huxley's career was marked by his prolonged commitment to a certain vision of eugenics. Even after World War II, he remained a vocal member of the British Eugenics Society, which he presided for quite some time. And his eugenics expressed fears shared by other thinkers of the time regarding overpopulation and other social crises, but they also translated his optimism, which rested upon the belief that humanity could not only be saved, but it could be improved. So he later than this first book, laid out carefully the principles of his eugenicist position, but he originally situated the very possibility of human improvement within a Bergsonian framework, really, within the framework of creative evolution. So humans were in an unprecedented position because they were not only products of creative evolution, but they were also capable of taking creative control over evolution. And so in some of his personal notebooks around 1912, just a few years later, he wrote, "Creation is not a thing of the past, but here and now, and that he, man, is the being to whom has been delegated some of the power of creation, for his own destinies are in his own hands, and it is within the power of his control to shape the future of his race." So not only did humans have the power to control their own future, they had the responsibility to do so in order to ensure their own survival. But he didn't view this as resulting in the advent of some perfect human. Evolution would remain creative, meaning unpredictable, in a Bergsonian sense. In another one of his notebooks, he wrote, "The mere sight of a city like London or New York is enough to make us realize that Bergson spoke the truth when he said that the creations of evolution had an absolute newness in that it was entirely impossible to predict them." So Huxley's take on the creativity of evolution added a social and political dimension that I don't think Bergson had anticipated at all. So, a few words to conclude now. So the aim of this talk was not to say that we should adopt the theories of Derbyshire or Russell or Huxley, but I do think these Bergsonian biologists can tell us something about the changing relationship between science and philosophy. We've seen 3 cases of biologists who in the early decades of the 20th century actively tried to include philosophical reflections into their theories about life. So if you remember the quotes that I had up at the beginning from current-day science popularizers, you'll realize that a lot has changed in 100 years in this regard. Bergson, I think, reminds us that our current state of affairs, in which science is deemed to have more authority than all other areas of knowledge combined, it's not always been the case. People have not always taken that to be true. There's a recent past in which thoughtful people were trying to think about how to combine scientific and other forms of knowledge. And so I think there's something to be gained by interrogating and historicizing these categories of science versus the rest, of objectivity versus subjectivity. But as you know, nowadays, a lot of scientific theories are under attack. Climate change is a good example of that, I think. So some of you might be thinking the last thing we need is someone to come along and say we should be taking other forms of knowledge into account. We should all be studying Bergsonian duration and considering them to be on par with scientific knowledge. But perhaps there's also an argument to say that unchecked scientism can be dangerous too. So by scientism, I mean the excessive belief that the power of scientific knowledge is all-powerful. That's not a very good sentence. It's exemplified by the fact that people like deGrasse Tyson and Dawkins take for granted that science is the highest form of knowledge in the hierarchy of all knowledge. Something that's quite revealing is that often famous scientists will be asked their expertise on topics that do not fall within their expertise. I remember when Stephen Hawking was still alive, I remember reading an article that said the title was something like, even Stephen Hawking can't understand Trump. Or can't understand the popularity of Trump. And I remember thinking, I'm sure his take on this matter is as interesting as any other clever person's, but why would he be able to analyze these questions? Does theoretical physics give you some insight into current day politics? I don't think you would ask someone who was a Nobel Prize laureate in literature to talk about black holes. So I was a bit confused by this, and I think this is very revealing about our current state of affairs. Why do we assume that because he's one of the best scientific minds of his day, that he knows everything about everything? It's weird. So I think Bergson and these Bergsonian biologists can help us think about the fact that without denying the importance of science, it might be healthy to admit that a science more in tune with the humanities is potentially a science more aware of its own limits. So an argument that's often made nowadays is that the people creating all the technology of tomorrow, for instance, in Silicon Valley, should be getting an education in ethics in order to learn to be reflexive about the potential harmful aspects of their research. It's basically the Jeff Goldblum argument in Jurassic Park. But more generally, perhaps, current-day scientists could benefit from better knowledge of the humanities. Some people certainly think Neil deGrasse Tyson could. So here's another one of Neil deGrasse Tyson's tweets. He recently said, in school, rarely do we learn how data become facts, how facts become knowledge, and how knowledge becomes wisdom. And this led some very frustrated person who calls themselves librarian shipwreck, so maybe some of you can relate here, I don't know, to reply, "Hi Neil, that's literally what we teach. Thanks for the shout out, sincerely, the humanities." So perhaps Neil deGrasse Tyson and all of us could do with taking a page out of Bergson's book without taking anything away from science. Maybe science doesn't tell the whole story. Thank you very much.
All right, we have time for a few questions. I'll come by with a microphone if you raise your hand. We're videotaping and live streaming, as Emily mentioned earlier, so we want to get the audio of your question on the live stream. But before we go to Q&A, before I forget to say this later, please join us. I think Emily mentioned that there are a few books on display in our History of Science Center. I just want to add, please don't take food and drink into the room. We have some tables set up. If you could put your cookies or coffee cups on the tables, we would appreciate it. So now, for Q&A, raise your hand, please.
I mean, really working hard to try to come up with a question as opposed to a statement. The three biologists that you cited, you cited for a very specific reason. Has their work continued up until today? Are they acknowledged as the shoulders that today's biologists stand upon, and everything they've originated has been embraced and built upon?
That's a question I get quite often, actually. So you're talking about Bergsonian biology, but is there a true legacy? Did this philosopher actually impact their science, or was he just impacting their philosophical reflections? And so one answer is yes, actually. Julian Huxley was very inspired by Bergson in his work on animal behavior. In particular, he was looking at certain birds and their courtship habits, and he used some of Bergson's theories about mind to reflect on the choices that these animals were making in their courtship habits, and some of those works are considered sort of to be founding works in animal behavior science. For instance, Derbyshire Derbyshire died so young that he doesn't have a huge legacy, but he really didn't necessarily integrate Bergson that much into his genetic research anyway. And Russell is now knowing a bit of a revival because there are arguments, and this is something that comes back all the time, but that we need a more organism-centered biology. So a lot of his ideas are being used. But, so that's one answer, but another answer I would say is, to me it doesn't matter, because I think what I'm trying to achieve is to show that through my historical research, I'm looking at a time when the distinctions that are implied in your question were not necessarily as important, or they were starting to become. So the early 20th century is perhaps a time where the extreme specialization that we know now was maybe becoming a thing. And I think these people were trying to resist that. So those are the two answers I would give, if that makes sense.
Great job, Emily. I know how much work you've put into this, so bravo. My question is, within Bergson's philosophical framework, how does he treat extinction?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I'm trying to remember now what he actually says in the book. I think he treats extinction and cases that at the time perhaps were seen as regressions, so what were called regressions, evolutionary regressions, but I won't go into that. But I think he treated it as, because he saw evolution was by nature something that was divergent. It's lots of branches going into lots of directions, and overall it's this trend of life trying to liberate itself from matter. So the times when it fails, when extinction occurs, for instance, there are times when matter won, in a sense, when the organisms weren't able to overcome the obstacles. I think that's probably...
Emily, I want to thank you for your presentation, as well as for the answers to the prior two questions. I'm a card-carrying evolutionary and developmental biologist, and so I greatly appreciate you bringing these issues to the forefront. And the reason why I say that is because, you know, when you cite Neil deGrasse Tyson and Richard Dawkins, and it comes across as if that's a consensus from the scientific community, it's not.
Okay,
We're a particularly more raucous group, and you know, unlike you know, organized religion, you know, disagreement is really the course for the day for us. So there's a great deal of disagreement, but it's really important for us to, as scientists, to actually emphasize the fact that the humanities actually do play an important role in the way in which we actually think about the natural world. And that has been the emphasis. I do agree with you 100%. That has been the emphasis in the way in which we actually teach our students, and in the way in which we actually think about biological processes. So what I just want to ask for you as a question is, given how much you have read about Bergson and his philosophy, which I have not really extensively read, you know, we have this problem in biology right now that we tend to associate astronomical time with biological time, which is the way in which we think about duration. And so I'm wondering if in your readings you have found evidence from other lines of research or other researchers that have tried to address that at a more, you know, mechanistic level, or even at the level of Russell, looking at migration and the like?
I don't know. That's a really good question. I don't know how, if I'm going to be able to respond. But first, I'd like to say, I'm sorry if I came across as saying that I didn't mean to come across as saying that all scientists necessarily agree on this. It's more, you get these very prominent figures in the media who are tweeting. You get people, so Neil deGrasse Tyson, who I think is doing a great job at actually promoting the science. I'm not trying to, I think he's, I think a lot of the aspects of his work are great, but then sometimes humanities people get a bit frustrated when he suddenly suggests, oh, maybe our politics should be based on rationality, and historians are like, well, that was the Enlightenment, so maybe, maybe read a history book. But so. I'm aware that there are lots of thoughtful scientists who don't fall into these caricatures. As to your question, I don't think I'm qualified to respond at all. It's a really interesting question that I'd love to be able to follow through with you. If you find anything, let me know, I guess, is what I'm going to say. Thank you.
Right before we go to another in-house question, I just want to add that anyone watching online, just type in your question, whether you're on livestream.com or on Facebook, and I will ask Emily the question. I think there was a hand or two up here.
Thank you, Emily. Kind of a follow-up on the previous question. I noticed, at least in your talk anyway, in reference to Russell, but also Bergson as well, you mentioned basically three different types of time. You have time in a kind of a metaphysical absolute sense, or even time in a vulgar sense, and then historicity. Is there some sort of distinction that Bergson draws out in his writings that kind of could help kind of just differentiate those three, or I'm going down a rabbit hole here that leads nowhere?
I think I might need a whole lecture to discuss this question in particular, but how to say that, to formulate this succinctly. I think the starting point of his philosophy is to think about sort of individual, consciousness and the individual experience of consciousness, and how one can discover. So he's a very firm believer in free will, and free will is discovered through the experience of duration. And every one of his books after that, except the one on laughter, which we do not talk about, kind of builds upon that idea but expands it and also changes. So when he's then talking about evolution as a whole, the history of life as a whole, there are lots of analogies between the individual experience of what he calls pure duration. So I would need a whole lecture I don't know how to talk about it succinctly, but we can have coffee if you want and talk about it a bit more.
Does Bergson address the question of whether or not natural selection favors higher intelligence?
So, Bergson was he was fairly critical of natural selection because he had quite a narrow understanding of it. He saw it as a process of elimination, only of elimination, and so that couldn't then fit with this idea of creation, of creativity rather than creation. So he did not think that natural selection alone could explain the advent of something like intelligence. But then again, in his book, he was very, very clear, saying that, because he was also critical of Lamarckism and of at the time there were lots of different sort of competing theories of evolution. He was critical of all of them, and then he kind of said, but I'm a philosopher anyway, and they all are a certain point of view on the reality that I'm trying to describe as a whole, and so they're all right in a certain way, and they all get some stuff right, they all get some stuff wrong. I'm looking at the bigger picture, is it kind of what he's saying. So he's not doing the same thing as biologists, is what he's saying. So he wouldn't necessarily have an opinion on that particular question, if that makes sense.
Thank you very much for your presentation, and sorry if this is like a selfish question, but I'm wondering if Bergson is following like a Kantian Husserlian idea of time and with his duration, and if you could speak a little bit more to that.
Yeah, so I can't say much about Husserl, but Bergson was very much he very much built his philosophy in opposition to Kant. And his first book, Time and Free Will, it's both a discussion of current day, so 1889, current day experimental psychology, but it's also a critique of Kantian time, as in, so again, a whole lecture would be required, but Bergson disagreed with the notion of time as an a priori category. Yeah, again, I probably shouldn't go into more detail than that, but that can give you an indication. A lot of his theories were actually built explicitly against Kant. Husserl, I don't really, I wouldn't be able to say.
Hi, Emily. Now I know what you've been doing for the last couple of weeks. I'm amazed. If this question goes beyond your dissertation, don't bother to answer it. But I'm wondering, since Bergson dies in 41, you see the rise of the molecular evolution period, physical biochemistry after the war. What do molecular biologists or early molecular geneticists think of Bergson? Where does his work go? Does it go anywhere? Do they incorporate it at some point?
No, I don't think so. What I've been trying to argue, I think, in my dissertation is that there's this kind of, so Bergson's nephew had an expression, there's this Bergson boom in the very early 20th century, and everyone's super excited. And that kind of declines after his death, and even before his death, when he kind of removes himself from the public eye. So there's not necessarily as much enthusiasm about his theories later on, but I've been trying to show that some of these things still persisted, though. So, for instance, Huxley, who was very much involved in building the framework of what we now refer to as the evolutionary synthesis, the modern synthesis. He wrote the book called Evolution, the Modern Synthesis. Even in this book, which was written much later than the book I mentioned, these Bergsonian ideas about progressive evolution are still there. So perhaps it wasn't fashionable anymore, or perhaps it wasn't seen as respectable anymore to mention Bergson's name, but yeah, he persists somehow. He endures. That's the pun I should go for. He endured. Yes.
All right, Emily, let's do a couple more questions. I know there was a hand up right here. And we have an online question from, if I'm pronouncing this correctly, Kaz. Okay.
Oh, hi, Kaz. If it's the Kaz I know, hi.
And she says, hi, Emily. and great job.
She's a PhD student at Leeds as well.
Okay. And she says, this might be a bit more philosophy than biology. Does Bergson have a theory of personal identity to go along with his ideas on duration? Or would that be a whole different talk?
It would be a whole different
talk. If so,
talk.
could you please give it? No, she didn't say that.
It would be a whole different talk, but yes, actually, so the true self, according to Bergson, is this sort of unmediated experience of time, which we very rarely have access to, because the way we talk about our own perception, our own inner perceptions, the way we even talk about very simple feelings or sensations. If we say, I'm hungry, I wasn't hungry earlier, but I'm hungry now. These language itself kind of is not able to reflect this kind of ever-flowing reality of consciousness. We're putting on top of it categories that help us express it, otherwise we wouldn't be able to express it. So the true self is the layer underneath sort of all this added stuff, if that makes sense, Kaz. I hope it does. We can talk about it more when I get back to Leeds otherwise. But
This is a very practical question, less about biology and philosophy. What attracted you to the Linda Hall Library?
Well,
and how did that work out over the last few months?
They have fantastic collections of. I mean, a lot of my work is early 20th century, but in terms of just the periodicals, the journals that I've been able to access here, sort of whole runs of journals that I would otherwise have to, you know, at Leeds I'd have to go to a different library or order from somewhere else in the country. Here I just have it all there, so it's just been fantastic. So going through their catalogue at the time when I applied allowed me to see that I would highly benefit from, and I have, from working here. So this message was sponsored by the Linda Hall Library. No, but honestly, if there are any PhD students out there watching, or I highly recommend applying.
And the deadline's coming up in January, right, Ben? All right, thank you, Emily, for a wonderful talk.